The Ferriols Resource Center for Filipino Philosophy is a fledgling unit of the Philosophy Department of the Ateneo de Manila, which is focused on promoting the teaching of philosophy grounded in a Filipino rationality. It equally aims to promote research in Filipino philosophy grounded in Filipino praxis, experience, and thought. Towards this end, we have opened this YouTube channel, which will hold talks and discussions on themes that have emerged from the practice and experience of Filipino thinkers. In this video, we are presenting the research of Pamela Joy Mariano Capistrano of the Ateneo de Manila University. Her work is an important example of how we can use philosophical frameworks to understand issues of social justice. Her work also shows us how philosophy can speak to very concrete issues of justice. We hope that this work stimulates further applications of philosophy in addressing the injustices our people face.
At first, the idea was I was going to talk about my PhD research, but I realized that I could hit two birds with one stone because I was working on the proofs for this paper that it's going to be published later this year in the journal Thesis 11, which is a journal of critical theory, critical social theory. And I thought that, well, this this article still draws from my PhD work, which is very based on actually some field research. And in this paper, I use approaches that are both grounded in the Philippine experience as well as informed by decolonial theory or movements to decolonize theory in dialogue with critical theory. So thanks for the invitation, and I hope this is going to be a fruitful class for you. And it might be a bit long. I tried to cut out a lot of the technical and expository parts of my paper, but I also still want to keep the general structure of my paper, and I hope it's okay if I read through most of it because I tend to ramble if I don't read. So I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions afterwards. So good afternoon again. So let me start. In Anti-Colonialism and the Decolonization of Political Theory, Adam Getachew and Karuna Mantena reimagine approaches to decolonizing political theory that move beyond the critique of Eurocentrism of political philosophy. They propose approaches of decolonization that are rooted in the diverse realities and struggles of post-colonial situations. And one of their proposals is called conceptual reanimation, which they describe as the reformulation and retheorization of existing concepts in political theory, quote, as a result of their circulation and instantiation in post-colonial contexts. As I read their work a couple of years after beginning the field research that informs this paper, I found that they articulated my own desires and intentions, that the post-colonial experience, particularly in our case, the post-colonial experience of the Philippines, can enrich political theory and in so doing, add to its analytical and critical power. In this paper, I intend to rearticulate and enrich the conception of structural injustice from the experience of the Philippines. I draw from the post-colonial rural social reality of the Philippines, particularly the concrete experiences of smallholder corn farmers and local trader financiers of Bukidnon, focusing particularly on why farmers persist in farming genetically modified high-yield variety corn, or GMHYV corn for short, despite the very clear disadvantages and financial losses. By making the concept speak from the post-colonial context, to borrow Getachew and Mantena's phrase, I intend to demonstrate not only the power of the concept of structural injustice when used in social critique, but also further directions in which it can be taken beyond the positionalities from which the concept first emerged. How will I do this? To do this, I will first present a survey of Iris Marion Young's conception of structural injustice and its further development in the work of Sally Haslanger. I will then turn my attention to Philippine corn farmers and traders' accounts of the social structure of GMHYV corn farming in the Philippines, specifically in Bukidnon. This context is an example, I argue, that of how social structures and practices of global capitalism enculturate in a rural, post-colonial, global south context. From this concrete case, I will conclude the paper by pointing towards the further directions that the concept of structural injustice can be taken, directions opened up by making the concept speak from the post-colonial context. So let's begin first with that overview of the critical social theorist Iris Marion Young's conception of structural injustice and how it's further developed by Sally Haslanger. So, in the posthumously published Responsibility for Justice, Iris Marion Young examines the nature of structural injustice before proceeding to interrogate who ought to be responsible for such types of injustice. In her account, structural injustice is distinct from injustice that is directly caused by the actions of individuals, groups, or institutions, and she asserts that structural injustice instead has to do with an individual's position within their social structural context. This social structural context, in turn, is not the outcome of one or a few actions or a single institutional policy. Rather, it is born of social structural processes that working together that all members of a society participate in different ways. For Young, structural injustice is not solely attributable to the wrongs of individual interaction, to bad luck, nor to any single law or policy targeted against a specific group of people. As she writes, and as I quote on the slide, structural injustice exists when social processes put large groups of persons under systematic threat of domination and deprivation of the means to develop and exercise their capacities. At the same time that these processes enable others to dominate or to have a wide range of opportunities for developing and exercising capabilities available to them. Structural injustice is distinct from the wrongful action of an individual agent or the repressive policies of a state. Structural injustice occurs as a consequence of many individuals and institutions acting to pursue their particular goals and interests, for the most part within the limits of accepted rules and norms. She further argues that the nature of structural injustice requires us to reformulate and reconceptualize a concept of responsibility for justice, thus the title of her book, as our existing conceptions of responsibility in legal and moral philosophy remain at the level of interpersonal or at the level of the relationship between a corporate agent and the direct wrongs that it has caused. She further argues that no single agent or institution is solely for doing justice, and on this basis begins formulating a conception of political responsibility that unfortunately is unfinished because of her untimely death. Please let me know if you're having issues with the internet because Ateneo Internet just told me that it is unstable. So please signal to me if you can't hear me properly. Okay. Where was I? Since the book's publication, Young's conception of structural injustice has been taken on by a lot of other theorists and applied philosophers. It's been applied in fields as varied as critical race theory, bogeyman me, Trump, environmental ethics, climate change, bioethics, public health. And I take this as a demonstration of the power and resonance of Young's conceptualization of structural injustice for the purposes of critique. Moreover, as Maeve McKeown shows, after Young, there have been efforts to further develop this concept, and these efforts build on Young's ideas. They accept Young's ideas as the foundation. She highlights the efforts of Alation Nuti, Sally Haslanger, and herself to further develop this conception within the ambit specifically of feminist critical social theory. For my purposes in this paper, however, I've just chosen to focus on Haslanger's work on structural injustice, a social ontology that explains the relationship between individual agents and the unjust social structures that they participate in and perpetuate. As McKeown explains, Haslanger delves deeper into what a social structure really is and how it can be critiqued. Haslanger herself builds on the concept of structural injustice by focusing on this idea of a social structure, which in Young's work is actually kind of a loose concept. Young uses the term interchangeably with social systems and social institutions. However, this conceptual looseness has led some commentators to misinterpret structural injustice to be focused simply on formal institutions or formal systems, which results in a distortion of the concept of structural injustice because it wants to focus precisely on broader structures of society and not just formalized institutions of society. Haslanger's work offers a corrective to this through developing a conception of social structure that includes not only these formal institutions, but more informal social practices, social groups, and social relationships. Formal institutions are just a subset of the larger category social structure. Drawing on the work of William Sowell, Haslanger proposes a social ontology that helps us understand any social structure to be the result of and emerging from specific social practices. What are social practices? Social practices are the mutually influencing or looping relationships between, on the one hand, individual agents and the cultural techniques that these individual agents have on the other. Cultural techniques, in turn, are the result of the relationship between individual agents and resources. Resources here refers to anything that agents value, and cultural techniques to patterns of behavior that emerge as means of regulating agents' access to these resources. She often quotes the following passage from William Sowell, which is a good starting point for this understanding. Quote, structures shape people's practices, but it is also people's practices that constitute and reproduce structures. In this view of things, human agency and structure, far from being opposed, in fact, presuppose each other. To understand social practices, therefore, we must first understand how they are shaped by cultural techniques and resources. Cultural techniques, according to Sally Haslanger, are intersubjective patterns of, quote, perception, thought, and behavior embodied in individuals as a shared cluster of open-ended dispositions to see things in a certain way or to respond habitually in particular circumstances, end quote. These can be quite localized to a particular group or can be common in broader societies, but nonetheless share the same features. While these techniques are cultural, they're also individually instantiated. There is a continual interaction between our individual semiotic frames and the culture around us. An example that Haslanger offers to illustrate this is the cultural technique of the family. There is a certain range of behaviors, activities, and attitudes that are associated with the family that we tend to assume and take for granted as broadly understood within our given culture. Sorry, I lost my my spot. There's a certain degree of shared understanding, or what Haslanger calls shared meanings or social meanings, of what people in families ought to do, such as care for each other, fulfill parental responsibilities to children, and what they ought not to do, such as abandon children or hurt them. At the same time, particular individuals can have their own instantiations. For instance, as a mother, I can take it as my maternal responsibility to show my child that women and men ought to handle housework in contrast to perhaps a cultural norm that says housework is exclusively a feminine activity. To take this example further, it's important to notice how the behaviors, activities, and attitudes of being part of a family have much to do with how people manage not only themselves and their mental states, but also the sets of objects that we associate with families. the systems of knowledge that we associate with family life, and so on. These objects and systems of knowledge are what we call resources, which I already mentioned earlier. Resources account for the materiality of social structures, but they can also include non material things such as knowledge and status. In short, a resource is anything that is of value to people, whether positively or negatively, the use of which requires coordination among people because there's this resource and we need to access it, but we can't just access it willy nilly. As mentioned earlier, cultural techniques and resources have a looping relationship with each other. They sustain each other, and this allows them to remain stable and adaptive over time. This means that techniques and resources mutually influence each other. The kinds of resources that we value and are available to us influence the norms of our culture, and conversely, the norms of our culture influence how we value the resources at hand. Conversely, changing resources in the world can modify cultural technique. Taken together, schemas and resources form social practices. Now that we have a bit of a sketch of what social practices are, we can return to Haslanger's assertion that social practices result in social structures. Social structures, even though they have a sense of materiality, are also, quote, in an important sense, the product of coordinated behavior. Social practices are what establish socially accepted roles and relations, such as that means categories of people and the roles and relations they fulfill within these practices to ease coordination. Power comes into play as well in these roles and relations, as certain roles can be more or less powerful in reference to other roles. This network of roles and the different relations, including relations of power, between these roles as roles, composed of different roles of positions, of differing power relations, such as a parent and child, whose roles are pre established, in a sense, by the cultural techniques and meaningful resources for family life that we have received. As she writes, as I see it, practices are particular patterns of behavior that occur as parts of social systems. Structures are, in a sense, the skeleton that connects different practices and the social relations they instantiate in a social body. End quote. Buhay pa ba tayo? Hopefully you're still alive. So what's the value of understanding social structures as the result of social practices, and how social practices in turn are the product of cultural techniques and resources, and people basically figuring out how to coordinate access to these resources? For Haslanger, this is ultimately in the service of critical social theory, in view of social change towards less injustice and greater justice. We can better understand social structures as instantiated in specific material geographical contexts and understand how particular unjust structures are reproduced by our own actions, even without our awareness or intention. Haslanger's social ontology captures how structural injustice can be further understood as the result of cultural techniques that favor some agents by virtue of the position they occupy, with more advantages and access to a resource, over other agents with less favorable social positions. Thus, structural injustice for Haslanger implicates both the distribution of resources and the cultural techniques that implicitly govern their distribution. While the concept of structural injustice and this social ontology that Haslanger develops is quite useful and it has a lot of applications. It's also important for us to understand the context where this concept really began and where it comes from. What first led Iris Marion Young to the concept of structural injustice was the emergence of the anti-sweatshop movement in the early 2000s, and particularly the form that it took on US college campuses, where students successfully pressured their universities to source university branded clothing merch from non-sweatshop suppliers. Haslanger's work emerges from the US context of intersecting positions of race, gender, and class, and a dissatisfaction with the existing social ontology's ability or lack thereof to capture that intersection. While these conceptions from Jung and Haslanger already have quite potent critical power, they both nonetheless emerge from a very North American urban context. Do new features or aspects or additional critical tools that help us understand structural injustice better emerge from other contexts? I argue that if brought to bear upon the particular rural post-colonial Philippine context, new features and aspects of structural injustice do emerge. And this leads me to my field research. And the field research that I did for my PhD drew from was part of an interdisciplinary development research project called the Land Use Change in the Uplands Impacts and Drivers Project, or the LUCID project for short, which wanted to investigate the social, economic, and land use impact of the adoption and continued cultivation of GM HYV corn in the Upper Pulangi watershed of Bukidnon. So the Upper Pulangi watershed is like the northeastern part of Bukidnon, and it covers, the study covered two of the municipalities that are in that watershed. The province of Bukidnon, but why Bukidnon? Sorry, I forgot to say that. Why Bukidnon? The province of Bukidnon is the second largest producer of genetically modified corn in the Philippines. It's only second to Isabela. The policy assumption of the Philippine government has been, from the very beginning, that genetically modified corn will lead to increased harvest yields, which in turn increases small farmers' incomes, reduces the amount of required labor, and improves their quality of life. It has reduced the amount of required labor, but the other parts, the increasing incomes and improving quality of life, seems to belie this assumption. I will not go into the findings of the project in detail right now, but one crucial question that emerged from that project was why farmers persist in farming GM HYV corn, despite how it was very clear to them it was very precarious and they lost money. It was very easy to lose money. And they themselves articulated that question, like, why is it that we can't get out of this type of farming? And this was affirmed by the project's economic research, which showed that GM corn cultivation was high risk and low reward. It had no significant increase to the income of smallholder farmers. And it's very capital intensive, as the farming inputs needed, the seeds, the fertilizers, the herbicides, were all very expensive. And this question of persistence led me to an additional set of questions. Does GM corn farming in the Upper Pulangi require other non-economic forms of capital? And what is or are the social structural processes that enable and perpetuate genetically modified corn farming? So my interviews revealed that relationships were a very significant factor contributing to the persistence of genetically modified corn farming. Personal relationships that tied together small farmers with local trader financiers, and the broader social relations that tie these local trader financiers and local government patrons to multinational corporations. These relations are themselves a form of capital. I mentioned earlier that economically, GM corn farming is capital intensive. But aside from the GM corn the economic capital required to buy the seeds, herbicides, and fertilizers, and to pay for farm labor and transportation costs, financial success at GM corn farming also requires a certain amount of education that enables farmers to do research into the different seed brands and varieties available on the market, the suitability of these seeds for their farmland and soil conditions, a certain ability to navigate the social norms of financial processes, whether the formal financial processes for obtaining a loan from a rural bank, or the informal processes of negotiating a lower interest rate from a trader financier. A familiarity with the workings of the Philippine commodities market and its implications on corn pricing fluctuations. And finally, knowing the right people. In short, it requires a considerable amount of what Pierre Bourdieu has called economic, cultural, and social capital. So, according to Bourdieu, capital takes three forms. Economic capital is how we use capital in our everyday language, money and property. But second, cultural capital broadly corresponds to an individual's knowledge, understanding of concepts, and applications of intellectual fields, education, how these are objectified in cultural goods and technologies, and can be institutionalized in the form of academic credentials. And finally, three, social capital, which Bourdieu defines as, quote, the aggregate of the actual or potential resources, which are linked to the possession of a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition, which provides each of its members with the backing of the collectivity owned capital, a credential which entitles them to credit in various senses of the word. End quote. What options are available to those with limited amounts of these forms of capital? In the case of the small farmers of the Upper Pulangi watershed, who have historically been the subjects of marginalization, whether through exclusionary past policies on indigenous peoples or through homesteading policies that attracted poor migrants from the Visayas and northern Mindanao into Bukidnon. These three forms of capital are all in short supply. Many farmers say that they have no other option but to go to local trader financiers who act as gatekeepers of these forms of capital. They are in many ways dependent on local trader financiers and the different forms of capital they are able to access through them. An experience that I had at a demonstration farm illustrates this concretely. So, what's a demonstration farm? It's basically a farm where you demonstrate how good this new genetically modified seed is. And sales agents invite farmers to go to the demonstration farm. And why do they invite farmers? Because they want to sell their company's brand of seeds. That's it. They don't really offer much agricultural advice. At best, they say, oh, just follow your usual practice. But the thing is, different seed varieties have different soil and nutritional requirements. And these require modifications of farmers' practices depending on those seeds. None of this information is made accessible to the farmers, neither by the seed companies, the sales agents, nor by the local government's agricultural technicians. Instead, at best, these are resources that they can access only through the trader financiers, or those who are willing to share this information with them. And these resources fall within the category of cultural capital. Hosting a demonstration farm is also a manifestation of cultural capital and social capital. The seed companies monitor these farms and work closely with the landowner of this farm, sending research teams to take regular soil and crop samples. These agri-tech teams advise the landowner regarding the proper planting techniques for the seeds, the application of chemical inputs for optimal plant growth. The landowner thus harvests and earns more than their neighboring local farmers who don't have the benefit of this information. All the people that I interviewed who had demonstration farms were trader financiers themselves. Sorry, where was I? Kind of lost my spot. Sorry. Okay, there. The trader financiers that I interviewed, unlike most of the small farmers, also had undergraduate degrees, ran other businesses aside from GM corn farming and trading, and were seen by the local community as padrinos. One was even a long serving barangay captain who had recently finished her final term in office. Local trader financiers are godparents to farmers' children, sponsors at farmers' weddings, and generally esteemed members of the community. Is it possible to opt out of GM corn farming? Though a small farmer may be interested in shifting to other cash crops or to organic farming and intercropping practices, about a third of the farmers I interviewed expressed this. Making the shift is difficult because there are no broader systems supporting them. Shifting to a different crop still requires economic, cultural, and social capital. But where to access these? This further emphasizes the relationship of dependency that exists between small farmers and local trader financiers. Shortly after my interviews in 2020 and shortly before the lockdowns, one of the municipalities in the Upper Pulangi watershed began calling itself the corn capital of Bukidnon, promoting the expansion of corn cultivation. They even built this monument to corn, a giant concrete corn cob rising from the middle of the fields, impossible to miss from the national highway. Perhaps it's no coincidence that the mayor of this municipality was formerly a large corn trader and financier in the area before his election into office. I go back to this image a lot as I think of the concept of structural injustice as instantiated here in the Upper Pulangi watershed. It has become an image that continuously unsettles me. The structural injustice of GM corn farming in the Upper Pulangi, as it turns out, is not simply one structure of relations, but rather a structure superimposed upon and interacting with other social structures that have preceded it. Structures whose origins can be traced back to colonial and post-colonial social forms. The injustices that result from the structures and processes of GM corn farming, the cycles of debt and dependency on trader financiers that small farmers find themselves in, are intertwined with and mutually dependent on prior social structures of patronage that are the result of Bukidnon's social and colonial and post-colonial history. These relationships of patronage in GM corn farming not only echo but build upon the already extant relationships of patronage that have their roots in the US colonial era. The province of Bukidnon, though de jure part of the Spanish colonial claim, only had a small number of Spanish colonial settlements and reducciones, like a handful. Small towns established through the missionary zeal of the Jesuits, who sought converts from the indigenous people before the outbreak of the Philippine War of Independence in 1896. It was only after the resolution of this war and the subsequent Philippine-American War that the American colonial government successfully established formal political and social systems and institutions, most importantly, the public school system, across the province. Accompanying American administration was a concerted project of resettlement, which invited highly educated Filipinos from the Visayas and the northern coast of Mindanao to move to Bukidnon in order to occupy middle management civil service positions and work as public school teachers, where they became mentors to the indigenous population, facilitating their assimilation into the new colonial systems. There were some, but not enough, educated indigenous elites to fill these positions. Though not explicit on paper, the American colonial officials avowed that they would foster democratic equality and protect the interests of indigenous peoples versus enroachment from these migrants. These mentorship relations nonetheless reflected a hierarchical nature, fostering dependence of those belonging to the or lower educated classes upon those of the higher educated class. This implicit hierarchy was not just based, though, on one's levels of education, but also, and in some ways more importantly, one's proximity to political, cultural, and economic power. In this case, the power of the white American colonial administrators. While the origins of patronage relationships in the Philippines can be traced back to pre-colonial social hierarchies that promoted dependency, the system of tribal datus, for example, This system was nonetheless exploited by American colonial officials and their local proteges. While ostensibly promoting democratization and supposedly preparing Filipinos for self governance through benevolent assimilation, American colonial officials quickly realized that they could make a big profit, from exploiting the island's resources. Instead of introducing a more egalitarian social order, colonial officials set themselves up at the top of the hierarchy. The most vivid example of this is the figure of Dean Conant Worcester, the first Secretary of the Interior and the longest serving member of the Philippine Commission of the United States. Bukidnon, by virtue of its inhabitants, fell under his direct administration, as did all other areas of the country inhabited by tribal groups. As Worcester, quote, mandated to himself the responsibility for the care of the so-called non-Christian tribes, end quote. A trained zoologist, Worcester had first traveled to the archipelago as an undergraduate student at the University of Michigan to do research, and quickly made a name for himself in the US as the preeminent expert on the Philippines. He had like multiple volumes on the Philippines published in the US. Worcester expressed a paternalistic stance towards the non-Christian tribes under his administrative purview, hoping to both prevent their exploitation by the elite Filipinos from the Christian lowlands and to prepare them for self-determination. On the other hand, he would also express admiration for Sir James Brooke, the infamous White Raja of Sarawak, and wanted to occupy a similar position among the non-Christian tribes. The rolling plateau of Bukidnon also reminded him of the American Wild West and the fortunes that were made from it. He dreamed of eventually leaving government service in order to make his own fortune from this new frontier. And Worcester did eventually leave government service to work for the American Philippine Company, or AMPHILCO, which he helped establish while still Secretary of the Interior. Hooray for conflicts of interest. Amphilco ran, among many other agricultural enterprises in Mindanao, a large-scale cattle ranching operation in Bukidnon, which accounted for 30% of all cattle in the Philippines by 1919, as well as a lucrative coconut farming, processing, and export operation in the neighboring province of Agusan. He also had a personal cattle ranch in Bukidnon, dating back to his time as Secretary of the Interior. Worcester also installed his proteges, the former cowboy Frederick Lewis, as lieutenant governor of the province, and Lewis's right-hand man, Manuel Manolo Fortich, as his assistant governor. When Lewis was reassigned to be governor of the neighboring province of Agusan, Fortich would become the first Philippine-born governor of Bukidnon. Fortich himself was of mixed Spanish heritage. He was born in Cebu and migrated to northern Mindanao in the course of serving in the Philippine Constabulary, and it was there that he met and impressed Worcester when he served as his guide to northern Mindanao. Fortich became the big man of Bukidnon, the patron of all Bukidnon. For the people of Bukidnon, Don Manolo was, quote, the paternalistic authority figure on whom they grew to depend for jobs, justice, and a host of personal favors, end quote, a role which he embraced aggressively. Much like his mentor, Fortich also became a cattle rancher and by the late 1920s had become one of the largest individual private ranch owners. In the figures of Worcester and Fortich, we have archetypes of the relationships of patronage and dependency that continue to be replicated in Bukidnon through the 20th century to the present, long after the Philippines ceased to be an American colony. In the intervening years, Fortich's descendants would continue to occupy positions of power in the province and cultivate their own relationships of patronage on the local level. Worcester himself is also one of the first conduits between Bukidnon and the structures of global capitalism. Under his administration as Secretary of Justice, corn was first introduced to the Bukidnon people as crop, And through his work with Amphilco, he brought American agricultural technology and agro-industrial corporate interests to Bukidnon and Agusan. With the rise of the American colonial institutions in the Philippines, Worcester's fortune and influence, he ultimately achieved his dream of emulating the frontiersmen of the American West, earning his fortune from the rolling plains of Bukidnon. Yet, while he and his protege and the rest of the local elites, mentors to the poorer populace, reaped the benefits of American expansion, the rest of the population did not benefit. Though Worcester and those who came after him did indeed introduce modern food production, as Philippine economic historian Mardonio Lau writes, quote, "It is tempting to state that the food production program that was carried out by the Americans in the province was simply a smokescreen, calculated to conceal the colonizers' ultimate economic motives in the area." End quote. What benefits locals did receive only came to them through the generosity and largesse of Worcester, Fortich, and other patrons. And this generosity in turn concealed how it was the patrons who benefited the most from production, extracting their fortunes from the province. I now return to the questions with which I began. How can a specific situation of structural injustice in the Philippines inform and develop theory? How can this instantiation of structural injustice in a specific post-colonial context help re-theorize the concept of structural injustice? Through the work of Young and Haslanger, we are able to identify the nature of a particular variety of injustice, which does not result from injuries or injustices caused by actions of individuals or groups directed towards others. The concept of structural injustice articulates the variety of injustices that are a result of the social structural orders that people find themselves existing in and participating in. While Young is the first to articulate this concept contemporarily, we find in Haslanger's work an account of how these social structures form and perpetuate, how social structures arise from the repetition of social practices, and how social practices in turn develop out of recurring behaviors that organize and regulate individual agents' access to a resource. In the case of the farmers in the Upper Pulangi, we can observe how the social structure of GM corn farming arises from the repetition of the social practices that regulate and facilitate people's access to GM corn, the resource. We can further notice how, for small farmers, the access to this resource is regulated and controlled by trader financiers, who are the gatekeepers of access. In turn, this gatekeeping ultimately serves the profits of the trader financiers and of the global biotech seed and agrochemical conglomerates, the ultimate sources of GM corn seeds and other agrochemical inputs required to farm these seeds. Sociologists of agriculture have examined and continues to study these new social structures created by the rise of GM crops, and to demonstrate their unfairness, describing the new and unjust social phenomena engendered by GM crops. In the specific social structures that support and perpetuate the farming of GM corn in the Upper Pulangi, we see features of structural injustice that Young and Haslanger have articulated. Yet, the way the structure of GM corn farming is experienced by the agents in the Upper Pulangi is not only a result of the introduction of this new resource called GM corn. Rather, it is closely intertwined with their experience of pre-existing social structures of patronage. These social structures of patronage and dependency that tie small farmers to trader financiers are contemporary forms of the relations of dependency established and cultivated in the American colonial period. The dependency of the ordinary people of Bukidnon on the patronage of the local elites, and the elites using this patronage as a cover for the extractive use of local resources. Relationships that continue to be perpetuated in the post-colonial context. The intermingling of global capitalism with local post-colonial social structures of patronage is not a simple wholesale transposition of global capitalism into post-colonial society. Instead, they magnify each other. Their interaction exacerbates the injustices that each already perpetuates, restating and retheorizing the concept of structural injustice from this specific post-colonial context, the rural Philippine context, demonstrates not only the conceptual richness and usefulness of the concept structural injustice, it also demonstrates how different social structures established during prior historical periods interact with newer social structures established through global capitalism, and how global capitalism in the global south further exacerbates existing structural injustice, continuing and perpetuating inequalities established by colonialism. Post-colonial structures of injustice are used and taken advantage of by global capitalism to further their pursuit of profit. Thus, it behooves any critical theorist undertaking an analysis of situations of structural injustice in the world to be sensitive to the historical colonial context of these unjust structures, and especially the relationships between agents that promote and perpetuate injustice. Haslanger's social ontology invites us to take a closer look at the resources that are valued in the contemporary world, the reasons why these resources are valued, and the cultural techniques that continue to govern our relationships to these resources, and how these all form social structures that perpetuate injustices. By making these concepts speak from the context of the corn farmers in Bukidnon, I also show how such an examination can and ought to be used to highlight the specific kinds of unjust extractive relationships that were established through and persist even after the history of colonialism, and how these are mutually reinforcing. Part of this examination must necessarily include understanding how contemporary global capitalism is enculturated specifically in different global south contexts, highlighting both their similarities and differences to the global north. Finally, this examination of social structures and social practices and the cultural techniques and resources that underpin them can be applied to the practice of social theory, of critical social theory itself. It allows us to examine our practices. That is, how do we do critical social theory? Who benefits from this knowledge that we produce? How is this knowledge distributed? And who can access this knowledge? Has critical social theory been truly emancipatory? Or, in the process of enculturation, has it instead perpetuated relationships of extraction and inequity? Critical social theory must be sensitive to the interplay of culture, society, and economics through the passage of time. To miss the aspect of history is to miss the point. And I am done. It was my last slide. So thank you for your time. Sorry, I went a bit over time. I was hoping it would be just 45 minutes, but I went a bit over time. So I'm looking forward to your questions. Salamat.
Maraming salamat,
Can I
Dr.
stop sharing?
Capistrano. Sure, sure. Yes. So I'll just have a faces for our
Yay.
discussion. Thank you so much.
Salamat.
Okay. Maraming salamat. So, okay. So my question was whether or not you were able to deduce some sort of um, understanding of their own agency that the farmers have. And connected to that, I was wondering whether there are particular actions or maybe moments man lang where they displayed either resistance or an act of reclamation of their agency despite being tied locked in being locked within rather that setup of this dependency. I'm interested to know that.
Actually, that's a really good question, Aves. And that's actually something I talk about more in my PhD thesis itself. Because the focus of that thesis was actually um the agency of people within structures of injustice and how they act to respond to injustice or change the structure, or like, do they see any levers for change? For context, my PhD thesis is pretty long, and there was a lot of also capability approach. It's a weird set of bedfellows: critical social theory and the capability approach. But I think Amartya Sen would be very happy with that. I doubt Nussbaum would be, but Sen very happy. And in one chapter, I talk about how part of one way that we can see agency for the people most affected by an unjust structure is really in how they try to reframe their relationship to the resource, right? Kasi diba, Haslanger is saying that um well, cultural techniques, and they emerge because we're trying to all get to this resource. They emerge because they try to organize us. And part of, like, some of the farmers that I interviewed, the way I see it is that they just realize, I'm just gonna change the way I value this resource, specifically GM corn. It's either they'll value it in a secondary way. It's not the most important crop for me anymore. Or they'll give it up altogether. They'll just say, no, this is not, I don't think this is valuable for me anymore. And I think that's one way that a lot of these farmers ended up exercising their agency, like completely reframing the relationship to the resource, like not valuing it altogether or revaluing their relationship to it. And one of my favorite versions of the revaluation is um there's this type of hybrid corn seed which the genetically modified corn companies will call pirated seeds. Kasi nga, for them, intellectual property ang semilya. It's parang, but these seeds kasi, they were basically the product of um we're not sure if it's intended or unintended cross pollination between more conventional corn and the genetically modified corn. And coincidentally, the offspring retained the features of the genetically modified corn. Yung hindi mo na siya kailangan parang sobrang minimal ng weeding. It's really the resistance to glyphosate that we're genetically modifying for. Kasi corn is really, as I've learned, super labor intensive. Kasi it attracts weeds so much. That's why they developed glyphosate. Kasi we can kill everything else that grows except the corn. And then we've also engineered the corn to be a little bit more resistant to some pests. Pero it's really the glyphosate talaga, yung pinakamahalagang feature. And itong accidental hybrids, they retain the glyphosate resistance, but they're fertile. Yun yung problem kasi why you have to buy corn every time you plant. You have to buy new seeds with genetically modified corn. Kasi sinasadya nila na hindi maging fertile yung offspring para bumili ka ng bumili. Eh, diba traditionally, farming, tinatago mo yung seeds for the next planting season. And itong accidental hybrid na to, naitatago mo yung seeds for the next planting season because it remains fertile. So, this is called sige-sige. Kasi nga, sige-sige siya. Tumutubo siya. Sige pa rin siya na sige. So, the companies hate this. But the farmers love it. Kasi syempre, parang you get all of the benefits of the genetically modified corn without the expense of buying new seeds. I mean, the yung problem na lang wala, toxic talaga yung glyphosate. Unfortunately, it is a carcinogen. But that's another conversation altogether.
Wow,
Or at
I
least
didn't even know that.
oo, sobrang like there's so much about just even corn farming that is itself fascinating, and you find a whole system of resources and the way people value resources and the different ways that they relate and to the resources, and how it's governed by so many cultural practices, the cultural techniques nga, na for them it's just the way they exist in the world. But as sort of an outsider, it's easier for you to see, ano talaga siya, it's a technique that has emerged in response to organizing ourselves around this resource. And because it's something that emerged around the resource, if we just change one factor of that looping relationship, mababago mo rin yung practice. And eventually, mababago mo rin yung social structure. And that's what I found really fascinating. Of course, it's harder if you come from a disadvantaged position in the social structure because you have less resources, you have less um connections, you have less of the three kinds of capital ni Bourdieu. But nakikita nila na pwede, posible, parang we can make new practices, we can change the way we do things, parang ganon. Yun lang. It takes more time. It takes more
Mm-mm.
resources. It's harder because you come from a disadvantaged position.
Right. But they are there institutions that support. Follow up lang to. Magigive chance to others to kind of it. Are there
Sige.
parties in support of the farmers who help them in,
I mean,
creatively acting? Mm.
sa Pilipinas kasi yung classic answer dyan, civil society eh. But I noticed especially in Mindanao now, again, this is my opinion, this part. This is an effect for me of the resurgence of red tagging and the demonization of leftists na nalalump in lahat ng klase ng civil society organizations, and that makes organizing harder. And this is something that's anecdotal but I think can be corroborated by evidence. Wala lang akong data for that. But I really think that um part of it is the chilling effect of red tagging. Ang daming
Yeah.
NGO na medyo tali yung kamay dahil ayaw nilang madamay sa accusations na komunista sila, ganyan.
Ang galing. So kasama pa rin nga yun. Ang galing, no? It's the same thread since, okay. Okay, bakit parang napapatanong ako, ba't ba tayo stuck dito? Okay, okay. I will give chance to others. Tanong kay Dr. PJ.
Pwede rin kayong magtanong ng mga how, how questions, hindi yung philo
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, yeah.
Ano? I think that's a good question to ask. How did you get to this? It's not as I one of the ways I describe it, it's an unconventional way of doing philosophy.
Naisip ko tanungin yun, pero sabi ko, pag nakasalubong na lang kita, kasi, yeah, kasi parang, ang ano nga, kakaiba. Kumbaga, biglang corn. Diba? Biglang corn, lalang, corn. Tapos, ang galing though, kasi yun nga, yung accidenting pollination, pwede siyang maging source of action. Ganun. Meaningful action against this kind of system. Sige, meron akong tanong kasi na nakasabit mula dun sa kanina ko pang tanong. Ano ba yung ibig sabihin kung bakit high risk? Dahil ba dun sa mga health risk? Or, kasi sabi kanina, yung GMHV? GMHYV.
Why?
YV. Ay high risk, low yield. So what makes
Oh,
it high risk?
specifically kasi in the geographical features nung area, kasi bundok siya, corn is not really a mountain crop. It's really a crop that was originally planted in the plains of the of North America. Wala pa yung United States. So flat or rolling hills lang talaga siya. So yung bukid nun, 'di ba? Puro bundok siya. And it places the crops at a higher risk because kung magkaroon lang ng bagyo, wala na. Parang wash out na lahat ng nung tinanim mo. So high risk siya in that sense kasi hindi mo naman, especially with climate change, hindi mo na ma-predict yung intensity of rain, and may mga areas na hindi naman intense yung rain dati pero ngayon intense na yung rain. Tapos may element of drought. May isa ako na interview na ang tindi nung pinsala nila ng isang drought kasi because of El Nino a few years back, mga 10 years ago. So, ang daming madami siyang environmental risks that accompany the farming this crop in this geographical location na medyo na may mitigate halimbawa sa Isabela kasi maraming hindi naman patag pero like rolling hills yung Isabela na hindi nila, I mean, pag binaha sila, oo, mamamatay yung lahat ng corn. Pero hindi siya kasing uncertain as planting corn on a mountain. Kasi yun, hindi mo alam, biglang may flash flood lang na parang umulan lang overnight, medyo matindi lang yung ulan, tapos pagising mo, shit, wala na yung lahat ng tinanim ko. Gano'n.
So na-record natin yung shit, pero okay lang yun.
Oo.
Sige, game. Baka may ibang may tanong.
Hi, ako siguro I will ask the how. Thank you, Doc PJ, for this very interesting presentation. And yeah, at first it was overwhelming because it's not your usual philosophy paper or work, di ba? Kasi it draws a lot from field work and empirical reality. So I guess, could you walk us through the process of uh, transforming these empirical realities? Kasi it's also driven by a lot of data, right? Um, of transforming this into philosophical claims. Parang how did you determine which aspects of these experiences become philosophically significant? And I think this could also be useful for us kasi the class is turning into issue-based a class now, and we were asked to explore issues, di ba? And I guess you could share a lot from your experience here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Actually, that's a really good question, Wilson. How do you go from field research to philosophical claims? And it was something that continually evolved. And I had the luxury, to be fair, because I was doing research with a bigger interdisciplinary project na yun, fixed na yung questions nila. And then I do the research for those questions. But at the same time, I also had my own PhD project. And I came into that PhD project with general questions. And I found that the questions would be refined as I did all of the field work with the bigger development project. And I actually am really appreciative of my own PhD promoter kasi yung tawag sa Belgium. Because parang naging madali para sa akin to bridge that because it was a way of thinking that was, I don't know, more familiar to him and to other people in my department there. And a lot of it was really okay. Parang so you have this empirical data, you have these social science results, and these have been interpreted by these social scientists. So your contribution then is to probe deeper. para as a philosopher. So what's the philosophical questions here? I went kasi into the PhD with a broad sense of I wanted to think about structural injustice. I wanted to think about the capability approach because I feel like the capability approach and not just feel, I argue that the capability approach can be used as a means of assessing structural injustice. Because it tries to hold in balance both the individual agent and bigger social structures. And I also knew that I wanted to think about the question of justice and change. Like how do we make things better? So mula dun sa very broad questions, parang nag-iimbudo siya. Like there was a funneling. The more that I did the empirical work, the more that I read, because having empirical research, I was also reading a lot of philosophy. I read so much text that parang half of what I read, I never really um wrote about. Like, hindi kasi uso yung review of related literature. Um, but like the background understanding, sa footnotes ang sila. But it really helped me clarify that when it came to my PhD research, my questions were particularly about agency in in unjust social structures. So how do we understand agency in the context of an unjust social structure? How can we assess the level of agency a person has? Can we can that agent feel enough power to change that social structure? If not, why? If they do, why? Parang, and that eventually really led me to focus on the particular philosophers that I ended up focusing on. So like Haslanger, I only discovered her work in 2022. I graduated in 2024. I started my PhD in 2017. So ganun siya just natamaan pa ako ng pandemic. So, ganun katagal lang yung evolution. And unfortunately, sometimes you don't have the luxury of that space. But I think it's important to be able to have already a sense of the philosophical questions or themes that you're concerned about and engage in both of those things. And sometimes it can feel like hindi mo sigurado kung magtatakbo sila eh. And then, but as you get deeper into those things, it becomes easier to identify and specify how this empirical work informs philosophical questions. So, yun. Parang at the start of my PhD, may nagtanong talaga sa akin in a completely well-meaning way. Like a professor in the department where I was working, he was like, "Oh, that's so interesting, but that's a lot of history. How do we get to philosophy?" I was like, "Yeah, we're not yet there. Wala pa ako doon. Hindi ako nakarating doon." Pero that was like in 2017 or 2018. And then, yeah, I had parang hulog ng langit na lang din yung pandemic because it gave me extra time to really work through the philosophical questions. But I think it's to have those philosophical questions from the start and to work through the empirical or field stuff. And then you find, the deeper you get into both, the easier it is to find the connections.
Salamat. Okay, anyone else who has a question? Meron pa akong isang tanong. Kung nag-iisip pa ang mga tao, kung okay lang. Babalik to sa unang tanong ko. Sorry, may oras ka pa ba? Okay, bilisan. Subukan kong bilisan. So, kasi I was stuck with the questions you stated toward the last part of your talk. Parang merong isang tanong na who stands to benefit from this knowledge, sino yung audience, sino may access dito sa knowledge na to. So babalik ako sa tanong tungkol sa kung tutuunan natin yung pansin natin sa farmers ulit. Sino ba yung merong kapasidad for responsible action? Sino ba yung may kapasidad para to act realistically? So at least based lang sa nakita mo, syempre very limited nga dahil nandun sa napapaloob ang lahat sa structure na yun. Saan merong butas or saan may meaningful intersecting, alam mo yun, lines kung saan merong pwedeng gawin or may posibilidad man lang manganak ng pwedeng gawin, parang ganon.
Actually, meron akong isang na-interview na trader, financier that I felt was like a really good example of that. And it actually, parang ang dami akong mga other things that I want to write. I just don't have the time. But I felt, I didn't get to mention it in my presentation. One of the other people working in structural injustice in that literature, sa feminist critical social theory, si Maeve McKeown, she tried to make like a typology of different types of structural injustice. Yung pure, like it's really the result of nobody's bad actions. It's really like all of the social practices taken together. Ay, merong people that are bad, worse off. And there's the um deliberate, which is the opposite end. Like there's people who are taking advantage of their position in the social structure, deliberately perpetuating the social structure because they know that they gain from it. And then there's the in-between one. And syempre hindi ko maalala ano yung pang pinangalan niya dun sa the one in between, where there are people within the social structure who potentially can help change the social structure because they have relatively more power within that social structure. So this guy, this particular trader financier that I interviewed, I felt was an example of that type of person. You know, they occupied a position in the social structure that was relatively powerful in comparison to the small farmers, but also not super powerful kasi hindi naman siya yung corporation, diba? He was like a trader. And but he had actually, parang when talking to him, I found it fascinating that he had this perspective that allowed him to see how the system was benefiting him and how that was something that disturbed him, and he wanted to make ways to spread the profit. And then he was thinking, parang at the time, I don't know, actually, that's the sad part of the pandemic. Hindi ko na sila nabalikan. But at the time, he was thinking of creating a parang system of, if you borrow money from him to finance your corn, whatever whatever brand you end up buying, ganun, his condition would be you have to follow my recommendations for the type of input. And then he was working with like an agronomist who would be formulating, ito yung optimal mixture of like the fertilizers. Kasi ang daming different kinds of fertilizers to match this type of corn, this type of genetically modified corn. So parang kapag humiram ka ng pera sa kanya, hindi ka lang humiram ng pera, but you kind of package deal the technology, the scientific support, ganun. So yun yung isa niyang naisip. Parang I know that I have these advantages because I have this technological know-how and I have the resources to access this technology and this information. So maybe I can find a way to make that accessible to the farmers without naman na masyadong pinipilit sila. So parang ano lang, kung gusto mo humiram ng pera sa akin, ito yung conditions. So, parang ganun. Kasi maghihiram sila ng pera from other traders, they still are at liberty to choose from which trader they borrow from. Parang ganun. Yun yung isa niyang naisip na parang mitigating way. And parang hindi siya nagpapa-lock in sa isang corporation. Kasi may mga traders na parang suki lang sila ng isang korporasyon. And parang siya, ayoko nun kasi there's a kind, parang he feels that it can make one beholden to that corporation. And instead, he wants to be able to be honest with the farmers na, oh, itong brand na to, ito yung good parts and bad parts, itong brand na to, ito yung okay, ito yung hindi maganda, ganun. So parang gusto niyang maging, parang kaya niyang sabihin in a more objective way, I guess, na hindi siya affiliated with any specific brand. Parang ganun. So, interesting yun.
Interesting nga. Oo. Kasi
Tsaka yung,
innovative, no? Oo.
oo, tsaka yung yung mismong, just yung mismong interest rates for lending. Kasi meron talagang yung usurious talaga.
Yeah.
Taas naman ng mga lending nyo. Grabe, ang tindi. Kasi alam nila na there are certain farmers who don't meet the minimum qualifications for borrowing money from the rural bank. Kasi masyado maliit yung lupa nila or they don't have complete papers or whatever. So, some traders will take advantage of that. Tas ang laki talaga nung interest. And then, two trader financiers that I interviewed, sinabi talaga nila, ayokong maging usurious lender. So parang tinatry nilang, hindi nila afford yung kasing baba ng rural bank. But they lowered it to be as close to the rural bank as possible. Na parang may sense pa rin sa kanila to do it. So it's not really completely profit-driven. Kasi meron din mga traders na parang profit-driven talaga. I really want to expand my business. I really want to grow and I need to profit.
Yeah. Okay. Sana mas marami pa. Anyway, sige. Diniktahan. Okay. Okay. Kung walang katanungan ng ating classmates, wala na nga ba? Just checking. 5, 4. Parang klasiko talaga. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. PJ Mariano Capistrano, for such an enlightening talk. As in literally enlightening. Literal. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that if people here have some questions, or if suddenly they find themselves in a research area that require them to kind of get in touch with you, they can just always bug you in the department naman, no? Okay. All right. Maraming salamat. At
Salamat
pwede
din
na
sa,
bang...
sa invitation. We're
Okay.
done.
Salamat. Teka lang, pwede na bang mag-dismiss ng klase? Ano bang sabi ni Doc Cos? Pwede ba?
I guess,
Bilangan din
yes.
natin ng 5, 4,
4.
3. O sige. O siya.
Yeah.
Yun na to. Ito na yun. Sige. Salamat. Maraming salamat, PJ.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Salamat
Thank
din.
you.
Bye-bye.
Hi guys, I couldn't open my phone, but yes, dismissed and I was listening, PJ. I don't know how to open my Zoom. Anyway, love it, PJ. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Ganda. Sobrang ganda.
Salamat.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Love y'all.